May I say how much of a pleasure it is to be here in Chicago with all of you, far more than we expected when we initially conceived of this meeting. And I know I speak for all of you when I thank Julia Stash and her colleagues at the MacArthur Foundation for so generously hosting and organizing this meeting. As many of you know, I had to miss the Lisbon meeting unexpectedly. I want to thank all those of you who sent me warm messages as I underwent cancer treatment. I'm glad to say I'm fine, but I want to assure you that throughout this rather daunting expedition, you and impact investment were never far from my mind. And we find ourselves here today for one very basic reason. We understand that the world cannot continue in the way that it is going. We're acutely aware that billions of people across the planet are leading lives of hunger, of sickness, of hardship and despair. Lives that are nasty, brutish, and short. And we understand that our societies cannot thrive if we do not change path, that a curtain of fire will come to separate rich and poor across our cities and our countries if we do nothing. And so we come to think of what can be done. And what can be done is not tinkering at the edges of our system. It's beginning to reform our system so that the flows of capital within it achieve not only profit, but also social good. We realize that governments and philanthropists, unaided, cannot cope. Governments are spending more than the OECD governments, for example, more than they feel they can afford. More than $10 trillion a year go from OECD governments into social issues. 20% of GDP, twice the proportion that went in 60 years ago. They feel constrained in their ability to do more. And philanthropists give about $500 billion away each year. But for all the good they do, neither they nor governments feel they have the resources or the ability to bring a solution. And so, all of us here are innovating. We're innovating through impact investment to create a revolution, an evolution in thought, but a revolution in means to improve lives and the planet. Underneath our revolution is a shift in mindset that is carrying it forward. What is this shift? The shift is that in the 19th century and before, businesses and investors measured just financial returns. In the 20th century, we came to add risk and to try to balance risk and return. And that created new approaches to diversification of portfolios, to new asset classes like venture capital and private equity, which previously had been unheard of. And in their initial stages, were thought to be too illiquid, too long-term to take off. But look at what they have delivered. And so the shift that is occurring today on the back of the 20th century, in the 21st century, is the shift to measure and to balance risk, return, and impact. It's a major change. It's a major change. If we are successful, it will change the nature of our system. But nothing less than that, in my view, is capable of bringing a remedy to the challenges that the world faces. Until we came along, conventional wisdom had it that nothing can be measured in the social sphere. How can you measure an improvement in the life of a prisoner who does not reoffend, or of a child who doesn't drop out of school? Impossible, it was thought. But with the first social impact bond in 2010, we brought the realization that it may be impossible to measure qualitatively an improvement in life. But look at the number of prisoners who don't go back to prison. Look at the number of children who don't drop out of schools as a result of our interventions. Calculate the cost to the country of prisoners reoffending and children dropping out. Put the two together and you have a measure of the social gain that we can achieve. And once you have that measure, you can connect it with a financial return for investors. And that is a major breakthrough. That is the key to the capital markets for social entrepreneurs working through not-for-profits, which up until now have only had donations in their armory to sustain their growth and the delivery of the services they bring. And profit with purpose entrepreneurs who seek to achieve the dual objective of delivering social good as well as a profit. So it is something unusual that we have developed together. The revolution of technology, as we all know, was led by millennial entrepreneurs. When I was a venture capitalist, people thought I was mad to be backing youngsters who often didn't even have business plans that were capable of being called that, who wanted to change the world. They delivered the tech revolution, which has transformed our lives in just 30 years. I lived through it. I lived through the first PC, through the first cellular phone, through the introduction of the internet, through the cloning of Dolly the sheep, a company in which my firm invested, where we lost the whole of our investment, but for the social good. The same is going to happen with the impact revolution. Millennials are driving it because they are disturbed by the inequalities they see and to which older generations have become inured. And because they are more interconnected globally, they empathize with those who are worse off wherever they may be. They want to do something significant about it. They want to improve lives, and they want to improve the planet. And they will bring the entrepreneurship and innovation to support the efforts of government and philanthropists. Investors are going in the same direction as millennials. In Holland, PGGM and APG, two huge pension funds with more than $600 billion of assets, and another 15 pension funds, have tied the investment of their portfolios to the achievement of the United Nations Social Development Goals. Here in the United States, under the dynamic and enlightened leadership of Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation, the Ford Foundation has allocated $1 billion of its $12 billion endowment to impact investment. The biggest global asset managers, many of which are in this room today, Goldman Sachs, AXA, Morgan Stanley, Wellington Management, UBS, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, are developing products and platforms to satisfy the needs of their clients for achieving not just profit, but social good. Initially, their products involve negative screening, but they are beginning to shift now as opportunities begin to be created by all of us and others like us to the creation of positive impact. Foundations, prominent legacy names like Ford and MacArthur and Rockefeller, and new living donor foundations like Omidyar, like Gates, like Bloomberg, like Chan Zuckerberg, are likely to be the ones who lead transformation of the philanthropic model. Not only through investing part of their endowment initially, and eventually making their endowment totally aligned with their social goals, but also by taking a portion of their grant allocation and channeling it towards outcomes funds, which pay for success and create the conditions for capital to come in support of social entrepreneurs who want to innovate and find more effective ways of helping those left behind, and doing so at scale. Big business is beginning to head in the same direction. Just last week in London, the Embankment project of the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism brought together more than 20 CEOs of multinational companies and global asset managers, representing about $20 trillion of assets. To do what? To begin to measure the impact they have. And some corporations are going beyond that, like Danone and Mars, to set specific, measurable impact objectives. Danone and Mars, as some of you may know, established a €120 million fund with one purpose: to improve the lives of farmers working in their supply lines in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The area where we have made least progress is the area of government. And it reflects itself in the activities of social sector organizations. The social sector organizations that deliver services to the poor and those left behind more generally are numerous. They number hundreds of thousands and millions across the world. They employ tens of millions of people. And yet they have one characteristic in common. None of them have money. And the result is, very few of them have scale. Those that have resorted to social impact bonds that enable them to create a balance sheet for a not-for-profit have brought great attention to our efforts. There are now, I'm told, 87 social impact bonds across the world in about 20 countries, tackling more than 10 social issues. Like the Educate Girls bond in Rajasthan, helping young girls not to drop out of school. Or the $30 million, the largest in the world, social impact bond in South Carolina for the prevention of teenage pregnancies. Or Tomorrow's People in the UK, which has had a transformative effect on the lives of unemployed youth. Or the Pathways SIB, which has just been launched by Social Finance, a $12.5 million SIB, targeting one of the key problem areas in our world, the area of immigration, helping immigrants to learn English, integrate themselves into life and into economic activity in the state of Massachusetts. Why have social impact bonds, which first appeared in 2010, which I was privileged to be involved in, taken 18 months or 2 years to craft painfully, one by one, when the first social impact bond was signed in just 3 months because of the pressure of an impending general election? The reason is the processes of government. It is in the area of government where there is the greatest power to build on what we bring, which is measurement of outcomes, which is most valuable for government, that measures inputs and never measures outcomes, and pay for success, where government only pays when the saving is actually being realized. And when we bring prevention, which costs a fraction of the cost of attempted remedies. It's in that area that we have progressed least. Why is that? Why is it that it is within government that the shift in culture and mindset is taking the longest time to achieve? Part of the reason is obviously that our time frames are much longer than typical electoral time frames. And ministers do not feel the urgency to do something the benefits of which is going to fall outside of their period of office. Part of it is that the attitudes to procurement are still very deeply ingrained in procedures which measure inputs, reduce the cost of a visit to a prisoner, and don't concern themselves with the reoffending rate. If we are to reach tipping point in the next 3 years, which is an ambitious target, but as Amit has shown, with a 29% growth rate and $150 billion of accumulated investment, is, in my view, an achievable goal. We cannot get there without persuading government to become our natural partner in our endeavors. So what does tipping point mean? Well, I'd like to put the following ideas for your consideration in our discussions over the next couple of days. For each of our constituencies, it's a different metric. For entrepreneurs, I would suggest that we consider whether we should aim for 10% of new visible startups to incorporate impact into their business model and to use profit with purpose corporate forms and certification like B-Lab. For investors, I would suggest that it's perhaps when 100 leading investment institutions, pension funds, and endowments allocate 5 to 10% of their portfolios across their asset classes to impact investment. For foundations, perhaps it's when 50 leading foundations across the world set allocations of 5 to 10% of their endowment and set a 10% allocation of their grant programs to outcomes funds. If we focus on achieving these targets, in my view, we will get to tipping point, which is that acceleration in growth, which characterizes the growth of a peripheral activity to a mainstream one. So what should the tipping point be for government? The tipping point for government, in my view, is the moment when government spends 10% of its subcontracted expenditure through profit with purpose agreements that attract capital from the markets, and the moment when governments publish the cost of social issues to them. Of course, some governments have led. In the UK government has introduced tax incentives for social impact bonds. As Tracy mentioned, it has released unclaimed assets to set up big society capital. It has set up a government outcome fund. It has changed legislation around foundations so that their trustees define achieving a satisfactory return, not just in financial terms, but in financial, social, and environmental terms. And of course, it set up the G8 task force, which is the springboard for our movement. In France, the government introduced initially as an option the opportunity for pensioners to direct some of their pensions in the direction of funds that invest 10% of their portfolios in solidarity investments. Today, 10 billion euros has flowed into these 90-10 funds. In the United States, important guidance was provided in 2015 to the trustees of both pension funds and foundations to enable them to engage in impact investment. And in Japan, spectacularly, the government is releasing about $900 million a year of banking dormant accounts, of which 40% will be held back in case there are claims in the future, but about $500 million a year will flow into impact investment to create a wholesaler of capital on the lines of big society capital. But if we don't get a government or many governments across the world to become motivated champions of impact investment, which is in their interest, it's going to take us a lot longer to get to tipping point for the whole of our constituencies. So we are engaged here in doing something momentous, as I said, in capitalizing on an evolution of thought to bring a revolution in means to improve lives and the planet. Venture capital, with which I was privileged to be involved, was the response to the needs of tech entrepreneurs who've changed the world. And I have to tell you, as I address all of you today, I have a strong sense of déjà vu. The impact revolution feels as powerful and momentous to me as the tech revolution turned out to be. The impact revolution, which has progressed over the last 3 years in quite remarkable ways. If you think of discussion about impact, it has become a mainstream conversation subject at home, in boardrooms, and in many government offices. That did not exist before we came along. If you think of the measurement of impact, it's also being discussed in foundations, in social sector organizations, in companies, and in government. So we have already met 2 challenges. The third challenge is the challenge essential to the success of our revolution, of tackling the flow of capital, of getting businesses and investors to optimize risk, return, and impact when they make decisions. If we succeed in doing that, we will change our whole system. And it is appropriate that we are discussing this in Chicago, where 40 years ago, Milton Friedman put forward a restricted view of the purpose of business. It is appropriate that here in Chicago we declare a broad view of the responsibility of business. The Dean of INSEAD, the European Business School, as you know, pointed out to me recently that a Nobel Prize awaits the economist who best manages to frame the interaction between risk, return, and impact. Perhaps it'll be another Chicago economist who picks up the prize. We throw the gauntlet to the Chicago School. The impact revolution is the only way we can improve the lives of people on the planet. Venture capital was a choice. Impact investment is a necessity. Together, let us bring the invisible heart of markets to guide their invisible hand. Thank you.